Welcome to the next in our series of studies into Christianity, and now we're looking at the flood. Most educated and intelligent people now understand that the story of Noah's flood is a myth. There is no evidence for a global flood which covered the mountains. The ark could not hold the millions of species that are now found on Earth. No wooden boat of the sizes given could go to sea without breaking up. The biggest ships at the height of wooden shipbuilding, just a couple of hundred years back, were about 300 feet long. The ark was supposed to be 450 feet and built by one family. There is no DNA evidence to show that all animals on Earth came from single breeding pairs a few thousand years ago. Long before the Bible story of the flood was written down, the Babylonian Epic of Gilgamesh tells us about a man called Utnapishtim. Let's compare the two stories. The gods told Utnapishtim to build an ark, just as God told Noah to build an ark. Utnapishtim survived the flood sent by the gods that wiped out humanity, and of course Noah survived the flood too. Before Utnapishtim spotted land, he sent out birds. At first the birds came back, then one didn't. It's exactly the same in the story of Noah. Utnapishtim celebrated, that means dry land, just as Noah celebrated. Happy Utnapishtim sacrificed to the gods, just as Noah did. And the gods smell the pleasant fragrance of the smoke, in both stories. Did they tell you in church that the Old Testament story about Noah was lifted from the centuries-older Babylonian myth? If the flood were a true story, what does it tell us? Well, let's read it in Genesis 7:23. And every living substance was destroyed which was upon the face of the ground, both man and cattle, and the creeping things, and the fowl of the heaven. And they were destroyed from the earth, and Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. In the flood God murdered every man, woman, every baby and toddler, every pregnant woman, every unborn fetus, plus nearly every animal on the planet. And he did this because he didn't like their behaviour. He murdered all of these, except of course for the family of Noah, who later became a drunkard. He murdered all of these, not by making them disappear or by putting them to sleep. No, he murdered them by drowning, by slow, painful suffocation and inhalation of cold, dirty water. The flood is an atrocity of the highest order. It is mass murder on a global scale. The idea that Christians would accept a mass murderer as their object of worship is very strange, is it not? Think about it. By supposedly murdering nearly every human on the planet, the Christian God is far more heinous than Hitler. No loving and perfect being can also be a mass murderer bent on global genocide, yet Christians willfully worship him. Why? If you are a Christian, look inside yourself. Why would you accept a mass murderer into your life? What does it show about God? Does might make right? What does this teach us about dealing with other people? What if someone offends you by their behaviour? Should you wipe them out? When did you last drown one of your children because they were naughty? This is genocide. Hitler tried to destroy everyone on the planet who displeased him. Even he only managed to kill 10 million or so, and his name is reviled to this day. We have only got as far as Genesis 7 in the Bible, and already God is far too nasty by human standards to deserve anything from us except condemnation. He is certainly far too horrid to worship. Because we learned this story as children, we are desensitized to its horror. No person who commits genocide can be considered good. Therefore, Christians worship God because they think he is mighty, not because he is good. After the flood, God kindly promises never to wipe out the human race again, at least not in exactly the same way. That's in Genesis 9:15. The flood story also contains the explanation for rainbows. Who knows, that may be the reason why the whole story was written down in the first place. Anyway, we can excuse God of all this bad behaviour. After all, it was a myth, and was probably written originally in a land that often suffered massive floods, Mesopotamia. We know that the first 11 chapters of Genesis borrow heavily from earlier Babylonian and Egyptian myths. Do you accept that the flood was a myth? Jesus didn't. In Matthew 24, Jesus is speaking, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark, and they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away." In conclusion, the flood is an ancient myth. We know this because of the story's ridiculous and impractical nature. We know it because of the evidence against it and the lack of evidence for it. We have hard copies of the myth it was borrowed from. If it were true, it shows God as a genocidal tyrant.